In the year 479 BCE, a bleak winter morning on a beach near Salamis, the air, thick with the scent of salt and smoke, hums with an unnatural metallic taste. Ash swirls across the sand, clinging to broken shields and splintered timbers, remnants of the once mighty Persian fleet. It's a beach of destruction. The poet will say that Greece when the marble will be carved with victorious name. But on this beach, among the ruins of battle, there's a sound not fit for the epic high-pitched, agonizing screams roll. Scraping the throat, more haunting than the cries of war. These aren't the screams of combatants bravely fighting for glory. No, these are the cries of despair. The screams of women who have seen the last of their world. They're coming from the tent city that stretches for miles along the coast. Tens of thousands of canvas tents, flapping violently in the wind like the sails of a ghost fleet. These are no barracks, these are pens. And inside them the spoils of war are held captive. Not gold, not land, but the daughters of Greece. Women, mothers, daughters of Athens, Megara, Corinth, those who watched their homes burn, their fathers fall in the streets, their children hidden in wells and storage jars, hoping for a quick, merciful death instead of the horrors that were coming. What happened to these women? It wasn't mercy. It wasn't simple cruelty. It was something worse, something with a name the ancient world gave enslavement. But it was more than that. It was a calculated campaign of annihilation, a policy designed not just to punish Greece, but to eradicate it from the inside. These women were not just taken, they were erased, their identities wiped clean. The Greeks may have triumphed on the battlefield, but there's a darker side to that victory. And as the world celebrates, these women remain forgotten. If you've ever wondered why certain chapters of history are told through the lens of men warriors on battlefields, this is the story of those whose voices were lost in the ruins. On this channel, Crimson Historians, we uncover the stories that were deliberately erased, buried beneath the victory that history chose to tell. So, if you're ready to remember what the world would prefer you forget, subscribe to Crimson Historians. The truth has been buried for too long. Now, let me take you back to that coastline. To understand the tragedy of these women, we must first understand the mechanism that destroyed them. Xerxes I was just a king, he was the living embodiment of a vast empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, an empire that conquered not just through force, but through a system so deeply embedded in Persian culture that it functioned like a second government. This system was called the harem, but it wasn't just about luxury, or veils and silken cushions. It was about control. It was about taking the daughters of the enemy and turning them into instruments of submission. It was about breeding a new generation of mixed-blood administrators who owed their loyalty to Persia, not to the lands their mothers came from. When Xerxes invaded Greece, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought slavers, scribes, and officials whose job was to fight but to catalog every city, every island, every village that fell, who lived, who died, and most importantly, who could be taken. The girls, the daughters of the conquered lands, were the priority. Not because the Persians were unique in their cruelty, many empires did this, but because Xerxes understood something that many conquerors did not. You don't just defeat a people by killing their men. You defeat them by taking their daughters, ensuring that the next generation grows up speaking your language, worshipping your gods, forgetting their mothers ever had another home. By the time the Persian army retreated after Salamis and Plataea, other 40,000 Greek women and children had been absorbed into the Persian administrative system. 40,000. Some were sent east to Sardis, some placed in labor camps. But the ones aged 13 to 25 were the ones Xerxes, a Persian general, examined personally. They ran soldiers, they were administrators, catalogued and catalogued again, checked for scars, for signs of virginity. Their names lost, their identities erased. Now let's take you back to that moment on the beach at Phaleron. It's the summer of 479 BC. The Persian army is preparing to retreat, but not empty-handed. The remaining Greek civilians, those too old, too young, or too stubborn to run, are being processed. That's what the Persians called it. Processed. Like grain. Like timber. Like cargo. The women separated first, then sorted by age, face a grim fate. Girls under 12 go to one group to be raised as servants, taught Persian, made to forget their old lives. Women over 30 are sent to labor camps in Thrace. But the girls between 13 and 25, they are the ones who are chosen. A girl is pulled from the line, her hair matted with dust and salt, her tunic torn at the shoulder. She's not compliant, she's learned not to resist. Her mother screams, but a Persian soldier strikes her down. Not to kill her, but to make sure she knows resistance is futile. Even their bodies belong to the empire now. A scribe records her details. Age, height, teeth, scars. Evidence of virginity. These aren't soldiers. These are administrators. This is a bureaucracy. The Persians saw these women as inventory, and the girls selected for the harem system were put on ships headed east. But not all of them. Some were kept back, held in camps. Why? Because if you break someone's spirit before you make them serve you, they integrate smoother. There's an account, a fragmentary letter from a woman named Clys from Corinth. Taken at age 13, she served in the royal house for 16 years. When she was freed, she wrote, "I have forgotten the hymns my mother taught me. I have come here to remember." She had forgotten her past, her culture, her identity. That wasn't enslavement, it was cultural annihilation. The girls held in these camps weren't prisoners, they were being educated. They weren't taught Persian customs, Persian food, Persian dress. Those who complied were rewarded with slightly better treatment. Those who resisted too much ended up in mass graves. One such grave, discovered near Sardis, contained over 300 women who had died from malnutrition, abuse, and neglect. Archaeologists found something strange. Almost all the skulls faced west, as if, even in death, they were trying to go home. By 479 BCE, the first wave of Greek captives reached Susa, the heart of the Persian Empire. There they became part of the royal harem, a political institution where daughters of conquered peoples were turned into assets of the empire. Their role wasn't for pleasure, it was for integration. Their children born to Persian fathers would become the next generation of administrators. The strategy was massacre, it was assimilation. The goal was just to conquer land. It was to conquer bloodlines. But not all of the girls made it that far. Some, like Thalia from Susa, resisted and were put into labor camps. She died from exhaustion after 8 months. But others survived. And their survival was worse than death because they became complicit in the system. One such girl, Roxane, writes a letter in 470 BCE. "I have learned the language. I have given him a son. He is beautiful. He has your eyes, but he will never know your name." Roxane's son would grow up Persian, never knowing his mother's Greek roots. This was the true cost of war, not just bloodshed, but the erasure of identity. Some girls did return to Greece. Some were ransomed, others escaped. But when they came back, they found their homes unwelcoming. One woman, Harmonia, returned after 12 years in captivity, only to be turned away by her own family and city because she had a child of mixed blood. The Greek victory at Salamis and Plataea was celebrated in marble and verse. But those left behind, the daughters of Hellas, were forgotten. The historian Theopompus once wrote of these women: they were taken. And though they returned, they are still gone. The silent women. And in time, no one called them anything at all. But their graves don't lie. Archaeologists have found the remains of women, showing signs of malnutrition, trauma, and childbirth at young ages. One such grave near ancient Thebes contained a woman in her early 22nd, buried with a clay tablet that reads, "I am daughter of no one. I am mother of no one. I am the forgotten." This story matters because it's not about Xerxes, and it's not about Persia. It's about what happens when empires decide the most effective weapon isn't the sword, but silence. The Greek victory was hollow because it came with a cost no one wanted to talk about. These women didn't die gloriously. They disappeared. But not completely. The tablets, the inscriptions, the stories carved into stone, they tell us they were here. They are still here, and they must not be forgotten. If you believe these stories should be told, subscribe to Crimson Historians. This history is theirs, and it survives only if we refuse to let it die. The silence is the hardest part of all. The Persian Empire won battles, and the Greek city-minor states celebrated their triumphs at Salamis. But what remained unsaid, buried beneath layers of heroic tales and marble inscriptions, is what happened to the daughters, the sisters, the wives of Greece. Their stories remain quiet, swallowed by time, but still in the silent corners of history they linger. The victors carved their names into marble, but they left behind the echoes of forgotten women. The tragedy of these women is often glossed over or completely erased, overshadowed by the victorious warriors whose names we know. But those who were taken, those who were forgotten, should not be overlooked. They should not fade away in silence, because the price of war is always paid by those who are not named, by those whose voices are lost in the margins. What happened to the women of Greece was not a mere consequence of war, it was a systematic, intentional destruction of their identity. Not just their bodies, but their cultures, their futures, their very essence. The Persian strategy was not to kill and conquer, it was to erase, to take a people's future and make it their own. The city-states of Greece may have driven the Persians back, but in their wake, the women left behind were forced to conform to a foreign world, one in which they no longer had a place. Some women were ransomed, some escaped, but many found that the world they returned to no longer recognized them. They had been erased. Take, for example, Harmonia's story, her return to Eretria after 12 years in captivity. She came back a woman changed. She was turned away by her own city, her own family, because she returned with a child of mixed blood, a son whose presence was a stain, a reminder of what she had endured. She was shunned, rejected by the very people she fought to return to. Harmonia's fate, and those like hers, is the untold chapter of Greek history. The Greek historian Theopompus observed these women in passing, like shadows moving unnoticed in the market, their identities erased by the brutal force of foreign conquest. They weren't aching, and though they returned, they are still gone. The silent women. This is the truth no one wanted to acknowledge. The truth that stands in stark contrast to the glory written into history books. And yet the graves tell the story. Across Greece, in regions once occupied by Persia, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites filled with the skeletal remains of women who lived in the shadow of captivity. These women's bones tell of starvation, of trauma, of childbirth at impossibly young ages. These graves are not just memorials to women lost, they are testaments to the systemic erasure of entire generations of Greek identity. One such grave was discovered near ancient Thebes. The woman was in her early 22nd, and beside her was a clay tablet inscribed with the words, "I am daughter of no one. I am mother of no one. I am the forgotten. Let this mark that I was." No name, just that. The tragic words of a woman who had lost everything, her identity, her family, and even her name erased. Forgotten by time, but not by us. Not by history. The true cost of Xerxes' invasion was just the battle at Salamis, where his fleet was destroyed. It was the army crushed at Plataea. It was what happened after. It was the daughters taken, the identities stolen. The women whose names would never be carved into marble, whose voices would never be sung in epic poetry. We've been taught that victory in war is measured by the lives of the soldiers, by the generals who lead them, by the lands and treasures won. But there's another measure of victory, one that's hidden. The conquest of a people's bloodlines, their cultures, their futures. The philosopher Plutarch said, "We remember the battles. We name the generals. We build temples to the gods who gave us victory. But the price of war is always paid by those we do not name." The daughters of Greece paid that price, not in death, but in silence. The cost of Greek victory wasn't just the Persians' defeat, it was the erasure of entire generations of Greek women, made complicit in an empire's designed for cultural domination. What Xerxes did wasn't just about conquest, it was about assimilation. It was about making Greece forget itself, turning the daughters of its people into pawns in a much larger game. By the mid-5th century BCE, the children of these captives were serving in Persian courts, speaking Persian, and helping govern the territories their mothers once called home. Xerxes didn't just invade Greece, he tried to absorb it. And this strategy, this quiet form of cultural annihilation worked. Because within the generations the line between conqueror and conquered had blurred. The mixed-blood descendants of Greek captives were no longer Greek. They were Persian, raised in the very culture that had once sought to destroy their heritage. That's what happens when you don't tell the stories of the women left behind. They don't just disappear from history, they disappear from existence itself. But not completely. Not if we remember them. If we read the inscriptions, translate the fragments, if we refuse to let silence erase their voices, their pain is written in stone. Their suffering, carved into tablets. Their legacy remains not in the glory of battle, but in the quiet whispers of history. And that is why their story matters. We must not forget them. And so, their story was buried. History as we know it is a selective narrative. It's not just the events of wars that we remember, it's the stories we choose to tell, the voices we choose to amplify. The poets of Athens, the warriors of Sparta, the philosophers of Greece, they dominate the pages of history. And those who bore the true cost of these victories, those who suffered in silence, are too often ignored. They are buried under layers of glory and triumph, their lives reduced to mere footnotes, their names lost to time. The women of Greece, taken by Xerxes and his empire, didn't just face the violence of war. They faced something more insidious, something that extended far beyond the physical brutality. They faced cultural erasure. The Persian Empire didn't just conquer land, it took the very soul of a people, turning their daughters into instruments of their own defeat. And in doing so, Xerxes and his commanders left behind a legacy not of conquest, but of transformation. A transformation that would change the identity of Greece forever. The story of the forgotten women continues to echo in the ruins, in the mass graves near Sardis, and the fragments of letters like those from Roxane and Clys. In the tablets that recorded their treatment, we find a story of survival and submission, of loss and reintegration. The women who survived this erasure were left with broken identities, no longer Greek, no longer Persian, but something in between. They were pawns in a game of power, the victor's cultural strategy playing out in quiet, bureaucratic ways that would go unnoticed by most of history. Roxane's letter, written decades after her captivity, haunts us. "I'm not who I was." It's a statement that transcends time. A woman who, in her own words, ceased to be who she had once been. Her very existence was transformed, not by violence alone, but by the slow and deliberate process of integration, forced assimilation that left her disconnected from everything she had once known. For many of these women, survival meant becoming complicit in their own erasure. They learned the language, adopted the customs, had children with Persian men, but they did so at the cost of their heritage, their identities, and their very selves. They bore children who would never know their roots, who would never understand the gods they once prayed to or the songs their mothers sang. Their legacy would be erased, replaced with a new one that belonged to the empire. This is where we must turn our attention, not just to the epic battles, the generals, and the warriors, but to the quiet, hidden narratives, to the women who never returned home, whose stories were erased in the quiet aftermath of war, to the mothers who never saw their daughters again, who spent the rest of their lives looking to the east, to the lands of their conquerors, wondering if their children were still alive, still remembering who they were. History remembers the victors. It writes the stories of battles fought on the fields, with generals who commanded armies, with cities that rose and fell. But the most dangerous part of war is not the swords or the battles. It's the silence that follows. The way an empire can wipe away entire cultures, entire identities, without anyone even noticing. This isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder of what happens when we ignore the silenced voices. When we forget those who suffered, who were erased, who lived on the margins of history, their pain not celebrated, not memorialized, but forgotten. The silent women of Greece didn't die on the battlefield, they were erased in a far more permanent and painful way. So, why does this story matter? Because it's a warning. A warning about what happens when we allow the silence to drown out the voices of the forgotten. A reminder that history is not just written by the victorious, it is also shaped by those who never get the chance to tell their stories. We must remember, the daughters of Greece were not just the casualties of war, they were the casualties of history. And if we do not tell their stories, if we allow them to be buried forever, then we too are complicit in the erasure. This is the lesson we must learn from the past. History will continue to celebrate the battles, the men, and the glory. But we cannot forget the women who were taken, the women whose lives were erased, the women whose identities were buried beneath the weight of empire. We must remember them, and we must tell their story. The unseen cost of empire. As we look back on the battles of 479 BC, the tales of Persian defeat and Greek victory are etched into marble, immortalized by poets and historians. But those grand narratives are incomplete. They leave behind the most painful and silenced chapter, the women who were taken, used, and ultimately forgotten. While men fought on the battlefield, these women, their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, bore the true cost of empire. Their suffering was just in the loss of their homes or families. It was just in the violence they endured. It was in the slow, systematic process of losing their identities, their cultures, and their connection to their past. The silence of the conquered. There's something uniquely insidious about the way an empire can conquer not just land, but the very soul of a people. Xerxes and his empire didn't just destroy Greece, they absorbed it from the inside out. By transforming its daughters into Persian mothers, workers, and wives. They didn't just kill, they erased. The Persian Empire's tactic wasn't only one of conquest. It was one of cultural annihilation carried out through bureaucratic efficiency, in a manner so calculated and methodical that it went unnoticed by most. Why does this matter today? It's not just an ancient tragedy. This is about how history remembers those who suffer. It's a stark reminder of how easily entire groups of people can be forgotten, how their pain can be buried beneath the weight of war, politics, and glory. For every epic written about Greek victory, for every marble statue raised in honor of men who fought in the battles, there are thousands of women whose stories remain untold, their names forgotten, their experiences erased. Their lives were swallowed by the very system that sought to conquer their land, their culture, and their identity. This narrative should haunt us because it speaks to a broader pattern of history, the erasure of those who are not deemed worthy of being remembered. The daughters of Greece were not the ones who wrote the history books, they were the ones whose pain was used to further an empire's agenda, their suffering never fully acknowledged or recognized. The legacy of the silent women. We will never know the exact names of many of these women, and their stories may never be fully told. But their experiences exist in the traces left behind, fragments of inscriptions, ruins, and bones. The silence they endured is preserved in the empty spaces of history, in the gaps where their voices were silenced by the hands of empire. The women who returned to Greece, who tried to enter society that had moved on without them, are the remnants of that silence. They were not only rejected by the land of their birth, but erased in the process of their return. They were outcasts in their own homes, their identities forever marked by the trauma they had endured. The tragedy of the forgotten women isn't just their disappearance from history, it's the way their suffering becomes a part of the cultural narrative, hidden in plain sight. The Greeks were victorious. The Persians were defeated. But at what cost? In the aftermath of war, as the poets sang and marble statues were erected, the women who had been taken, who had been made complicit in their own erasure, were left behind, their stories relegated to the margins. The final lesson. What happened to these women, to the daughters of Greece who were taken by Xerxes, is not just a tale of ancient history. It is a cautionary tale. It's a warning about the ways in which entire cultures can be dismantled from within. It shows us the vulnerability of history, how even the most significant victories can carry with them consequences that are never fully acknowledged. The Persian Empire may have been defeated on the battlefield, but the true cost of war is not measured in armies or battles won. The true cost is in the lives left behind, in the silenced voices that are never heard, in the quiet tombs of ancient Greece and the inscriptions left by those who survived. We find traces of the lost daughters of Greece. Their voices may have been silenced by time, but they are not gone. They live on in the stories we choose to tell and in the stories we refuse to forget. The persistence of silence. The tragedy of the women who were lost to history is not simply a tale of their erasure. It's a reminder of how power works, how societies define who gets to be remembered and who fades into nothingness. In every empire and every war, there are those who endure untold horrors, and their suffering is overshadowed by the more glorious narratives of conquest. These women did not just lose their lives, they lost their identities, their cultures, and their futures. They were written out of history, not by the victors, but by the indifference of a system that saw them only as tools for its own goals. The true cost of victory. In the grand history of the Persian Wars, the glory of Greek victory has been celebrated for centuries. But the true cost of that victory isn't recorded in the marble statues or the songs of poets. The cost is buried in the forgotten graves, in the testimony of women who were taken from their homes, stripped of their names, and integrated into a foreign empire. These women did not die heroically in battle, nor did they find their names etched into the annals of history. They endured slow, invisible deaths not just of the body, but of the soul. Their stories were buried alongside their memories, obscured by the myths of conquest and the glamour of victory. The Persian Empire, under Xerxes, may have been defeated on the battlefield, but it succeeded in something far more insidious. It succeeded in embedding itself within the very fabric of Greek identity by erasing it. By taking the daughters of Greece, by stripping them of their heritage and culture, Xerxes ensured that Greece would never truly be the same. The daughters of Athens, Corinth, Megara, and the other cities were absorbed into the Persian Empire, and memories erased, their lines remained in a foreign image. Eras were of culture and identity. What makes the story of these women so haunting is not only the brutality they faced, but the way their very identities were destroyed. The Persian Empire didn't just conquer Greece, it sought to absorb it to make it forget who it was. By forcing Greek women to learn the Persian language, customs, and religion by erasing their cultural identities and replacing them with those of the conquerors, Persia achieved something that no sword could accomplish: the slow, gradual extinction of a culture, one person at a time. The Persians didn't need to kill the Greeks, they simply needed to take their daughters, to make them part of a new generation that would serve the empire, speak its language, and worship its gods. The true cost of conquest was the death of Greek soldiers on the battlefield. It was the cultural death of the women who were left behind, whose names were erased, whose voices were silenced, and whose children grew up in a foreign world. The story we need to remember. Why does this matter? Why should we care about the women who were lost to history, the ones whose names we will never know? Because their story is a reflection of the power dynamics that continue to shape our world. History is often written by the victors, by those who hold the power. But in the case of the Persian Wars, the women who were Akin, whose lives were changed forever, their stories were left untold. Their suffering was ignored. Their identity was erased. What the Persian Empire did to these women is not just a historical tragedy, it's a warning. A warning that the true cost of empire is not always visible in the bloodshed of battle. They can be found in the quiet disappearance of cultures, in the slow erasure of identity, in the silence that follows the end of war. We must remember these women not just because they were victims, but because their story is part of a larger pattern that continues to play out today. In every war and every conflict, there are those who are forgotten. Their stories, their pain, and their suffering are left behind in the rush to celebrate victory and conquest. Remembering the forgotten. By acknowledging these forgotten voices, by remembering the pain and suffering of the women who were left behind, we are not just honoring their memory, we are recognizing the broader implications of conquest, of war, and of the way history is shaped. These women were not just victims, they were symbols of a larger, more insidious form of control. Their bodies were used to further an empire's goals, and their identities were erased in the process. But their story is not entirely lost. The inscriptions left by survivors, the fragments of their lives recorded in stone and clay, are testaments to their existence. These women may have been erased from the narrative of their time, but they are not gone. They live on in the traces they left behind, and the remnants of their lives that have survived the centuries. A call to remember. So, what can we learn from the story of these women? We learn that the true cost of empire is often hidden from view. We learn that history is not always about grand battles and heroic victories, but about the quiet suffering of those who are left behind. And most importantly, we learn that the stories we choose to remember and the stories we choose to forget are what shape our understanding of the past and our vision for the future. The daughters of Greece may have been lost to history, but their story is still worth telling. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of human identity, the ways in which empires seek to erase cultures, and the need to remember those who have been forgotten. The silent women, a legacy of erasure. The tragic reality is that these women, these forgotten daughters of Greece, did not die a heroic death on the battlefield. They did not become martyrs who would inspire songs or sculptures. Instead, they disappeared into the machinery of empire. Their names erased from history and replaced with new identities, Persian names, Persian customs, Persian gods. They became part of the system that sought not only to conquer their lands, but to wipe away their very sense of self. In the Persian Empire, this strategy of cultural erasure wasn't just about punishing the conquered. It was about ensuring that the next generation grew up with no memory of their origins. The women who were absorbed into the Persian administrative network weren't just enslaved, they were transformed into something else entirely to love the empire. The Greek girls who had once spoken their native tongue, who had once prayed to the gods of Athens and Corinth, were now speaking Persian, worshipping Persian gods, and raising children who would never know their heritage. The legacy of the silent women. The most devastating part of this story is that the victims of this erasure never had a voice. They were silenced, their experiences buried beneath the weight of history's official narrative. The daughters of Greece became the forgotten women of the Persian Empire, silent victims whose pain was never acknowledged by the victors. The poets sang of Greece's glorious victory, and the philosophers wrote of the freedom that Greece had won. But they never spoke of the women who were aching, never acknowledged the mothers who lived the rest of their lives haunted by the memory of their daughters, or the daughters themselves who were forced to forget their pasts. We are left with fragments, inscriptions carved in stone, tablets preserved in the sands of Bactria, the remnants of their lives scattered across ancient graves. These traces are all that remain of these women. Their voices long silenced by time, by empire, by war. But these fragments, however small, speak volumes. They are the only proof that these women existed, that they had a life before they were erased. These stones, these inscriptions, they are their testimony. The cost of forgetting. The story of the daughters of Greece is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a warning. It reminds us that empires do not just conquer land, they conquer identities. They rewrite histories, erase memories, and replace them with their own version of events. And this rewriting of history, this erasure of culture, is often accomplished not with the sword, but through assimilation, through forcing the conquered to forget who they were, to become something else entirely. We often think of war as a clash of armies, a contest of might, of power. But the real battle, the one that leaves the deepest scars, is the one that is fought in silence. The one that erases the very essence of a people, a culture, a history. That is the war that continues long after the final battle has been fought, long after the last soldier has fallen. It is the war of silence, of forgotten voices, of histories erased, why their story still matters. This story matters because it shows us the true cost of empire, the hidden, insidious price that is paid not in bloodshed, but in silence. The Persian Empire may have lost the battle for Greece, but it won a more subtle victory by erasing the cultural memory of its conquered peoples. The women of Greece were taken and forced to forget, and their children grew up speaking a foreign language, worshipping foreign gods, and living lives far removed from the world their mothers had known. But their story is still here, buried in the dusty archives of forgotten history. It is here in the tablets, in the inscriptions, in the traces left behind. And as long as we continue to read, to remember, to share their stories, they are not truly gone. They are not lost. The daughters of Greece may have been forgotten by their society, but we can choose to remember them. We can choose to honor their lives, their pain, their resilience. We can choose to acknowledge that their suffering was part of the cost of empire, part of the price paid for victory. They finally fought the price of silence. The philosopher Plutarch wrote about the price of war and the cost of victory. He said, "We remember the battles. We name the generals. We build temples to the gods who gave us victory. But the price of war is always paid by those we do not name." The daughters of Greece were the ones who paid that price. Their names may have been erased, but their story lives on in the fragments, in the graves, in the inscriptions. And it's up to us to make sure that their story is never forgotten again. Conclusion: remembering the forgotten. So, the next time you read about the battles of Salamis and Plataea, the next time you hear about Greek heroism and victory, when enter the silent women who were left behind, remember that the cost of empire is not always measured in the bodies of soldiers. Sometimes it's measured in the silence of the forgotten, in the erasure of cultures, in the slow, systematic destruction of identity. The daughters of Greece may have been silenced by empire, but their voices can still be heard if we choose to listen. And by remembering them, we give them back a piece of their history, a piece of their identity that was stolen from them so long ago. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the voices of those who have been forgotten, then consider subscribing to Crimson Historians. Help us uncover the stories that have been buried by time and silence. Because history is not just about the battles won and the heroes celebrated. It's about the voices of the forgotten, the ones whose pain and suffering have been erased. It's time to remember them. The power of memory and resistance. The tragedy of the daughters of Greece is a profound reminder of the insidious ways in which power works, how it bends and twists human lives until their original forms become unrecognizable. It's not just that these women were taken from their homes, stripped of their identities, and forced into the harrowing system of the Persian harem. It's that history, with its selective memory, chose to forget them. When we think of war, we often think of it in terms of battles won and lost, in terms of generals and armies. But the true scars of war aren't always visible on the battlefield. They are etched into the lives of those who survive it. The women who were taken didn't just lose their homes, they lost their very sense of self. and the generations that followed them were born into this altered existence, with no connection to the heritage of their mothers. This kind of erasure, this systemic rewriting of what it means to be a people, is a form of violence every bit as damaging as physical torture. It's the kind of violence that doesn't end with the fall of an empire, but persists long after the conquerors have gone. These women's stories are crucial to understanding the long-term effects of conquest, how it doesn't just change the shape of a map, but the identities of those who are subjugated, the forgotten ones, women and children in the wake of war. For those who managed to survive, the return home was not the end of their suffering, it was the beginning of another chapter of trauma. For the few who made it back, the price of their return was often too high to bear. Women like Harmonia, who returned after 12 years of captivity, found themselves facing rejection from the very communities they once called home. They were no longer the daughters, sisters, and mothers they had been. They were Zeus-tainted, default by their captivity and the barbarian touch that had marked them forever. In the case of Harmonia and others like her, the psychological toll of this rejection was incalculable. To return to your home, I need to find that it no longer accepts you, that you no longer belong, must have been a fate worse than death. They were outcasts in their own land, forever marked by their experiences, forced to carry the weight of their trauma in silence. The inscription from Eretria, in which Harmonia is rejected by her community, encapsulates the larger theme of how societies treat their survivors. When societies fail to acknowledge the full extent of the trauma experienced by their women during war, they condemn those survivors to a second death, the death of identity. Harmonia's inscription reads, "I have been defiled by barbarian touch and born a child of mixed blood. To accept me would be to accept the enemy." These words speak volumes about how the survivors of conquest were viewed not as the victims of an empire, but as the embodiment of shame, the invisible wounds of empire. There are no monuments to these women, no marble statues, no epic poems, no celebrations in their honor. There are only their fragmented stories written on the edges of history, etched in the faintest whispers of ancient records, in the crumbling tablets of an empire long gone. But in these fragments, in these silences, there is a truth that has been hidden for millennia. As we uncover these forgotten lines, we begin to understand that the most insidious legacy of empire is not the land it conquers, but the people it erases. The daughters of Greece were not just victims, they were symbols of a much larger process of cultural destruction. Their suffering was part of a calculated effort to not just defeat Greece, but to assimilate it, to make it forget its past, to rewrite its identity. In Persia's vast empire, the process of integration was not just about conquest, it was about transformation. These women were brought into the Persian system not to be punished with death or torture, but to be transformed into something else entirely, a new generation that would serve Persia, that would forget their Greek roots, their Greek gods, and their Greek language. It would become the link between two worlds, a world that no longer existed and one that was being built on its ruins. The echoes of their silence. But the true horror of this story lies not in the conquest itself, but in the silence that followed. These women did not die in battle, nor did they fall as martyrs. They were erased. Their names were forgotten, their voices silenced by the vast machinery of empire. They became the silent women, as Theopompus called them, a generation whose suffering went unnoticed, whose trauma was hidden from history. Yet, as we dig deeper into these forgotten archives, into the tablets and bones that survive from the past, we begin to hear their voices again, not in the way they would have wanted, not in the way they deserved, but here nonetheless. Through their fragments, their testimonies carved into stone, their bones found in mass graves, they speak to us across the centuries. And they remind us that history is not just made by the victors, but by the lives that are erased along the way. The hidden cost of empire. As we look back on the events of 479 BC, we are reminded that the cost of empire is not just measured in battles won or lost. It's measured in the lives of those left behind, in the people whose identities are destroyed, whose memories are erased. The daughters of Greece did not die on the battlefield. They were not killed by swords or arrows. They were killed by silence. Their suffering was not glorified, it was forgotten. Their story was not written in the annals of victory, it was buried in the margins of history, hidden away by the very empire that sought to erase them. In a world that celebrates conquest and victory, we must remember that the true cost of war is not just in the blood spilled on the battlefield, but in the lives destroyed in its wake. The daughters of Greece were not just casualties of war, they were casualties of history. And it is only by telling their stories, by refusing to let their voices be swallowed by time, that we can begin to understand the true price of empire, the legacy of forgotten voices. The fate of these women is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a cautionary tale for us today, reminding us that the stories we choose to remember and those we choose to forget shape the world we live in. The absence of these women from the history we know is not just an oversight, it is a deliberate erasure, one that serves to maintain the narrative of power, conquest, and glory. In the modern world, we still see echoes of this pattern. How many voices have been silenced in the name of progress, of civilization, of empire? How many stories remain buried in mass graves, in archives that no one visits, in the forgotten corners of the world where history has chosen not to look? These women, these silent women, are not merely a footnote in the history of the Persian Empire. They are a reminder that history is always written by the victors, and that those who resist, those who survive, are often forgotten or turned into symbols of something that never was. The real cost of war. What Xerxes did to the daughters of Greece was not just an act of conquest, it was an act of cultural erasure. It was a systematic effort to rewrite the identity of an entire people, to turn their daughters into Persian subjects, to make sure that the memory of Greece, and of their mothers' homes, was slowly erased with each passing generation. This wasn't about cruelty for the sake of cruelty, it was about creating a new order, a new identity, one that would grow up speaking Persian, worshipping Persian gods, and never remembering the lives they had once led. This is the true cost of war, the part that doesn't make it into the textbooks. We remember the generals, the battles, the victories, but what about the cost to the soul of a people? What about the destruction of their identities, the loss of their heritage, the erasure of their voices? The women who were captured by the Persians, like Roxane, who wrote to her sister in Thessaly, are the unsung victims of this kind of cultural conquest. And they have been fed, clothed, and even elevated in status. But what they gave up their names, their languages, their gods, their families was far greater than anything they could have gained in service to the Persian Empire. Roxane's letter, "I'm not who I was," is a heartbreaking testament to the transformation she underwent. She survived, yes, but in surviving she became someone else, someone who no longer remembered the prayers she had learned as a child, someone who no longer spoke the language of her otherland. Resistance through memory. The question that remains is this: what can we do with these forgotten stories? What can we do with the pain of those who have been erased, the ones whose names have been lost to time? We can choose to remember them. We can choose to tell their stories, not as the footnotes of history, but as the core of it. By uncovering their voices, by listening to their silent testimony, we reclaim a part of history that was never meant to be forgotten. In a way, the very act of remembering these women is a form of resistance. By acknowledging their suffering, we honor their humanity. We say that their pain matters, their stories matter, and that they will not be erased again. As we continue to unearth these ancient testimonies, these tablets, these inscriptions, these bones, we honor the women who were lost to time. We give them the voice that history denied them. In doing so, we remember that history is not just the story of great men and mighty empires. It is also the story of those who were left behind, those whose names weren't ever carved in marble, but whose lives were just as important. A new kind of victory. So what does this mean for us today? It means that we must look beyond the triumphs of the powerful and seek out the stories of the silenced. It means that the true victory is not in the battles won or the empires built, but in the preservation of memory, in the refusal to forget those who have been erased. The victory at Salamis may have been celebrated for millennia, but it was not complete. It left behind thousands of forgotten lives that we must now work to bring back into the light. In remembering these women, we not only reclaim a part of history that was lost, but we also ensure that the erasure of cultures and identities will never happen again. We honor the legacy of those who suffered in silence by giving them the voice they were denied. And as we do this, we build a future that is more just, more inclusive, and more honest about the past. Because the true cost of war, the true cost of empire, is not just in the lives lost on the battlefield, but in the lives erased from history altogether. A call to action. If this story moved you, if you are determined to make sure that these women, their stories, and their pain are not forgotten, then join us. Subscribe to Crimson Historians. Share these stories. Let's make sure that the voices of the forgotten are heard, that their memories are not lost to time. These women deserve more than silence, they deserve to be remembered. And by remembering them, we ensure that their suffering was not in vain. As long as we continue to listen, to learn, and to speak their names, they will live on. Not in the way they wanted, not in the way they deserved, but here with us. And in this way they will never be forgotten. The forgotten faces of history. These women whose lives were taken, molded, and buried within the systems of emperor, serve as a mirror reflecting the darker aspects of power. Their erasure was not an accident. It was a calculated strategy, one that continues to echo through history in subtle and not minus subtle ways. The Persian Empire's approach to conquest wasn't solely about the territories they claimed or the cities they destroyed. It was about the minds they shaped, the bloodlines they integrated, and the identities they wiped clean. By blending their captives into Persian society, by breeding the next generation of rulers and administrators, the Persians built an empire not just on land but on culture. They didn't just conquer, they absorbed, redefined, and reshaped the very fabric of what it meant to be Greek. The girls who were Achaean and later integrated into the Persian bureaucracy were the living embodiment of this assimilation. Their bodies became the tools of empire, their minds were conditioned to forget their origins, and their voices were silenced, sometimes permanently. Yet, even within the silence, there are cracks. The very fact that some of these women found a way to leave a trace of their existence, whether in inscriptions, in letters, or in the bone fragments untrees later, speaks to a form of resistance. A quiet defiance against the erasure, the legacy of resistance. It's easy to see resistance in the grand gestures, the military victories, the uprisings, the rebellions. But what about the resistance that lies in the refusal to forget? What about the women who carved their pain and their names into stone, who left behind a fragment of their humanity so that we could piece together their stories more annihilation? These small acts of defiance, these surviving testimonies are not just relics of the past. They are symbols of survival. The words left by Clys, Roxane, and the inscription found in the grave near Thebes aren't just about the pain they endured, they're about the power of memory. The act of remembering is an act of resistance. The idea that despite everything, despite the thousands of girls, the years of suffering, some part of them endured, and some part of their stories was preserved, is itself a victory. What can we learn? The story of these women teaches us a critical lesson about power and its reach. It isn't always enough to destroy the body, the mind, the spirit, and the identity must also be erased. It's easy to imagine the Persian Empire as an external threat, an invader, a conqueror. And what happens when that invasion is not just military? What happens when it seeps into the cultural, the personal, and the very fabric of identity? This was the true victory of Xerxes in the Persian Empire. Not just the subjugation of Greek land, but the attempt to subjugate Greek culture itself. By assimilating these women, by making them forget, the empire didn't just win a battle, it won a generation. And this is where we must look inward as well. The erasure of women from history is not a thing of the past. It continues today in many forms, whether it's through the dismissal of women's contributions in history, through systemic oppression, or through the deliberate silencing of their voices. We see a continuation of the pattern established by empires like Persia. This is not just a history lesson, it's a reminder that we must remain vigilant, a reflection of our own time. In many ways, the story of the daughters of Greece mirrors the struggle for identity and recognition that many women face today. They too are often forced to fight for their place in history, for their voice to be heard in the narratives of their own lives. The struggle for cultural identity, for agency, for the right to exist outside of the confines defined by others, this is a struggle that transcends time. When we read these ancient stories, when we translate these inscriptions and uncover these forgotten graves, we are not just learning about the past. We are learning about the systems that continue to shape the world today. Empires still seek to conquer not just through force but through assimilation. They attempt to erase cultures, to dilute identities, to silence voices. The daughters of Greece were not just taken, they were absorbed into a system that sought to forget them, to make them invisible. But they weren't entirely erased. Their stories, their pain, their lives, these are the things that persist, that refuse to fade away. The past will never be fully gone. It's written in the bones of the forgotten, in the inscriptions of the lost, and in the memory of those who refuse to let them be forgotten. The unfinished story, the legacy of these women is not just about their suffering, but about our responsibility to remember them. The Greek victory at Salamis was celebrated in grand epics, marble sculptures, and timeless philosophies, but it came at a cost that was hidden, buried, erased from the grand narrative of history. We must ask ourselves, what are we forgetting today? What voices are being silenced in the name of progress, in the name of victory, in the name of power? History is not just what we read in books, it's what we choose to remember. And as long as we continue to uncover the forgotten stories of women like Xerxesculturalannihilation and the thousands of others who were erased, we make sure that their lives were not in vain. The daughters of Greece didn't die gloriously. They didn't become legends. They didn't become martyrs. Most of them simply disappeared into history, and their stories weren't ever told. But we can tell their stories now. We can make sure that they are remembered. A final thought. And so, as we continue to uncover the stories buried in the sands of time, as we continue to read the inscriptions, translate the tablets, and piece together the fragments of these women's lives, we must ask ourselves, will we allow their voices to be swallowed by the silence of history, or will we refuse to let them fade away? The daughters of Greece deserve to be remembered, and it's up to us to make sure they are. Thank you for joining us on this journey of remembrance. If this story moved you, if you're ready to uncover the lost chapters of history, subscribe to Crimson Historians. Share this video. Let's make sure the forgotten voices are heard. Because as we've seen, when we remember, we give them a voice that time tried to steal. The ripple of forgotten lives. The absence of these women's stories in the grand historical narrative is not just a loss for them, but for all of us. Every time a story is erased, a part of humanity is erased. The Greeks who celebrated their victory at Salamis did so with triumph, with joy, and yet the cost of their freedom was written on the bodies of their daughters. These women, who had once been citizens of Athens, Corinth, and Megara, were not merely captives, they were the key to the next chapter of history. One written not by their hands but by those who held power over them. When we look back at ancient history, we often see a grand, heroic narrative. We see the battles, the kings, the warriors. But what of the daughters, the wives, the mothers? Their stories are not just footnotes, they are the untold truths that continue to shape the world today. And in their silence, their erasure, there is a deep lesson. A warning of what can happen when we forget those whose names never made it into the annals of history. The power of visibility. The daughters of Greece, those who were taken into the Persian harem system, did not simply vanish. Their presence lingered in the bloodlines they bore, in the children raised under foreign kings, in the records that speak of their assimilation, their gradual disappearance. They were made to forget their past, to leave behind their names, their gods, their languages. They became the perfect tools for empire building, blending into the fabric of Persian society, forever caught between two worlds. But their story does not end in silence. Every time we remember them, we reclaim a piece of what was lost. Every time we bring their names back into the light, we shatter the silence that was imposed upon them. We make sure that the empire that tried to erase them cannot succeed in its mission. Their stories matter not just because of the cruelty they endured, but because of the resilience they embodied in their very survival. The Greeks of the time, so quick to embrace the victory of their military prowess, failed to understand the price of that victory. It wasn't just about defeating Persia on the battlefield. It was about what they allowed to happen afterward. The women who weren't taken, the families who weren't torn apart, the cultures that were stripped away, these were the costs of war that no epic would ever memorialize. The unseen cost of victory. Victory, when viewed only through the lens of military triumph, becomes hollow. The men who fought at Salamis, the ones whose names are immortalized in history, did not pay the price of that victory. The price was paid by the daughters of Greece, whose names were erased, whose identities were stolen, and whose lives were shaped by an empire that saw them only as tools for future conquest. This is the true cost of war, the lives of those who never get the chance to fight, the voices of those who are silenced by the sweep of history. In the pursuit of glory, we often forget to account for the aftermath. The women who lived in the shadows of history, those whose stories were lost in the flood of heroic triumphs, are the ones whose suffering truly defines the cost of war. Remembering the unremembered. As we look at the graves, the inscriptions, the surviving fragments of these women's lives, we are forced to confront a history that has been selectively forgotten. These women didn't die in battle, they didn't go down in a blaze of glory. They lived, and in living they were made to forget. They became invisible, their names lost in the sands of time. But the very fact that we can still find traces of them, even after 2,500 years, speaks to the strength of their presence. Even in silence, their stories continue to resonate. To remember these women is to challenge the dominant narratives of history. It's to question the heroes we elevate, the stories we cherish, and the cost of victory. It is often ignored. The daughters of Greece were not just victims, they were survivors. And their survival, their quiet resistance, is something we can all learn from. A call to action. The stories of these women, CLYI Struxane Harmonia Thalia, and the many others who are lost to time, demand to be told. Not just as a reminder of the past, but as a call to action for the present. In a world where the voices of marginalized groups are still silenced, where the pain of historical injustices is still felt in the margins, we must remember, we must listen, and we must fight to make sure that those who have been forgotten are never silenced again. If you're still watching, it's because you know this story matters. You know that the women who were erased deserve to be remembered, their stories deserve to be heard, and their legacy deserves to be honored. By subscribing to Crimson Historians, by sharing these stories, by spreading the truth, you are part of that resistance. You are part of the movement to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself, that the silenced voices of today are never forgotten like the women of ancient Greece. Let's make sure their names are remembered. Let's make sure their stories live on. For them, for us, for the future.